In this video, we're going to be looking at how to record overhead costs during the year. Overhead costs have two separate types of overhead entries that we need to record during the period. The first one is recording applied overhead. Whenever we are looking at a job, remember that direct material costs are traced to the job, direct labor costs are traced to the job, but overhead is applied to the jobs based on an estimated predetermined overhead rate. Every time we apply overhead to jobs, we need to debit work in process inventory and credit the factory overhead account. I'm going to take you to Excel and show you the different journal entries. The spreadsheet already has some of the journal entries that we did for materials and labor, and we're going to be continuing with that same spreadsheet so that at the end of it, you will have all the journal entries in one place. So now let's look at applied overhead. Whenever companies apply overhead to jobs, they will increase work in process, so they're going to debit work in process for overhead applied, and then credit the factory overhead account. And I'm going to call this overhead applied. Now you can see that in the work in process inventory account, you have your direct material used, direct labor used, and overhead applied. Those three things make up the total job cost. Now let's go and look at what companies do when they actually incur overhead expenses, the actual overhead expenses. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. When companies record actual overhead expenses when they receive the bills, they're going to debit the factory overhead account and then credit the respective account dependent on what the item was. So if it's depreciation expense, it's not a bill, it's just a calculation, an adjusting entry at the end of the year. They're going to credit accumulated depreciation. If they receive a utility bill, they're going to credit utilities payable. If they're prepaying insurance or rent upfront, they're going to credit prepaid insurance or prepaid rent whenever they recognize the rent or insurance expense. But the factory overhead account is the account that's debited for actual overhead expenses that are incurred. Let's go look at the spreadsheet. Here's the journal entry for incurred overhead, debit factory overhead, and credit the related accounts. Let's see if I can find a color. We'll just do that in red. We're going to debit factory overhead account for other overhead and credit, depending on what it is, either accumulated depreciation, it could be utilities payable, or it could be prepaid insurance. It could be a variety of accounts. But the actual overhead is debited to the factory overhead account, and that's the part that you need to remember. Let's review the factory overhead account. Let me see if I can clearly label this. When you're looking at the factory overhead account, the actual overhead is on the debit side. The applied overhead is on the credit side. I want you to be aware of that. When we look at end of the year transactions, we're going to be looking at this factory overhead in more detail. That's it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions.